Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. We're very grateful to have you joining us for the Faraday Institute's seminar on Abraham Kuyper on Science and Religion, an introduction to his texts and contexts. My name is Jon Thompson, and I'm a research associate here at the Faraday Institute. Now on to today's seminar. We're delighted to have Dr. Jordan Ballor speaking to us. Dr. Ballor actually holds two doctorates, one from Calvin Seminary and one from the University of Zurich. He is now a senior research fellow at the Acton Institute, and he's also a postdoctoral researcher at the Free University in Amsterdam. Dr. Ballor is well acquainted with Kuyper's works, as he serves as the general editor currently for the Abraham Kuyper Collected Works in Public Theology. So he'll be speaking to us on Abraham Kuyper on Science and Religion, an introduction to his texts and contexts. We're going to have just about an hour for his talk, perhaps just under an hour, and then about 30 minutes for questions. So Dr. Ballor, I'd love to hand it over to you now.
Well, thanks very much, John. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity, and especially for making this a priority as we've had to delay the planned seminar for this year. There's been a lot of that going around, I know. Thanks especially to Julia and Alice and everybody at the Faraday Institute for working with me to set this up. It's a great honor to be here, and thanks all for signing in as well. As John's mentioned, the title is Kuyper on Science and Religion. In preparation for this talk, I really worked hard to try to bring some order, since that's one of the things that Kuyper thinks about science, is that it's the endeavor to place our thoughts in order, some order to Kuyper's own thoughts and thinking on religion and science and the relationship. So I'm going to proceed by working from his kind of more distant historical context, talk about some of the intellectual currents of his time, what he was concerned about, focus more closely on what he specifically says about science and religion, how those things interrelate, and then talk about some of the institutional context of his own time in terms of his own work and his own passions and what he did to put science and religion in a dialogue and constructively together. And then I'll conclude with some final thoughts and maybe some more introduction about some of the things that are happening and were scheduled to happen this centennial year and will be pushed on towards next year. So let me share my screen. I do have a slideshow together. So let me do that, and we can proceed. I assume, since the title of the seminar is about Abraham Kuyper, there's at least some familiarity with him. I've got his dates there. He passed away November 8th, 1920, so that anniversary is coming up. He held many hats during his career and his life. He was began as a minister, was an academic theologian, was also an academic in the sense of holding academic positions at the Free University, which he founded in Amsterdam in 1880. He's also been introduced as a kind of cultural or social entrepreneur. He was a builder of institutions, including newspapers, a weekly and a daily newspaper focused on religious and political audiences and subjects. And he was a politician. He served in the Dutch Parliament and rose to the office of Prime Minister from 1901 to 1905. He's been called, in what's I think appropriate given the context, the Faraday Institute hosting us, a kind of a dynamo. I think that would be good for describing the enthusiasm, the breadth and depth of his intellectual interests. So that's a little bit about Kuyper, his biography and his background. I don't want to spend too much time on that because we'll get into some of it, the more specifics, as we investigate his work on the relationship between science and religion. Much of his writing really comes from his roles as theologian and as a scholar and academic. So in the context of thinking about the task of theology in the modern world, the role of theology in the academy, and the overall coherence of scientific, that is scholarly investigation. So that's where much of this comes in from texts that are in those kinds of modes and those genres. There is a little bit that's certainly relevant for his understanding of science and religion in his political thought, especially as it relates to questions of, say, public health. And I'll touch on that maybe a little bit at the conclusion. But most of these works are from his roles as theologian and scholar. And I want to start with the distant historical context for Kuyper, which is certainly in his own self-understanding the Reformation and the Reformed tradition, most often directly associated with the Genevan reformer John Calvin, who's pictured there. And the point of departure, certainly by Kuyper's time and in his own understanding for the right understanding of Calvinism, is an emphasis, a unique emphasis perhaps among the Protestant traditions on God's sovereignty. Now for Kuyper, God's sovereignty, when you think of sovereignty, you should think of the transcendence of God, certainly the power of God, God's role as the creator of all things, the contingent created order. But it's also related not only to God as this kind of transcendent being, the fount of all good blessings and all good things that have come, but on God's active role in maintaining and governing and superintending that order that he created. So another word for that is divine providence. So for Kuyper, his understanding of science and the scientific endeavor and the role of the Christian faith in promoting the scientific endeavor is intrinsically and fundamentally related to his understanding of God's sovereignty, and especially his understanding of the divine decree, an aspect of which is that doctrine that's been associated most closely historically with Calvinism, that is predestination. So Kuyper says in his lectures on Calvinism and the lecture on Calvinism and science that if you proceed to the decree of God, what else does God's foreordination mean than the certainty that the existence and course of all things, that is the course of the entire cosmos, instead of being a plaything of caprice and chance, obeys law and order, and that there exists a firm will which carries out its designs, both in nature and history. So the divine decree for Kuyper provides a kind of an understanding of stability, we could term it, frame it in terms of God's covenantal faithfulness, is the stability of the created order, that God has had a plan from the beginning in instantiating creation, and he's going to be faithful and sure and true and see that plan comes to fruition. And because God is a God of order and reason and not caprice, there's trustworthiness and law-likeness and lawfulness in the entire created order. Now, the way we come to understand God and these truths about the decree and other things in God's providence are through, in the Reformed tradition, what are sometimes called the two books of Holy Scripture, that is special revelation, and the world around us, the created order itself. So Kuyper emphasizes that this goes all the way back to Calvin and to Reformed standards like the Belgian Confession in 1561 that uses explicitly this language of books, two different books corresponding, say, to special and general revelation, to understand truths about reality and God himself. And Kuyper says this about Calvin as a kind of inspiration for his own thinking many centuries later, but in that same tradition. Kuyper says, it's still more remarkable that Calvin, instead of simply treating nature as an accessorial item, as so many theologians were inclined to do, was accustomed to compare the scriptures to a pair of spectacles, enabling us to decipher again the divine thoughts written by God's hand in the book of nature, which had become obliterated in consequence of the curse. So for Kuyper, there's an intrinsic connection between nature and the creator of nature, the creator and the creation, in that sense that all things depend on him and point back to him. So Kuyper goes on and says this: not only the church, but also the world belongs to God. And in both he has to be investigated, that is, the masterpiece of the supreme architect and artificer. All creation, he says elsewhere, is nothing but the visible curtain behind which radiates the exalted working of divine thought. So the diversity of creation, too, is inspiring and reflective in some way of God's plan and the transcendence and fullness of God himself. Kuyper elsewhere says it's in its multiform diversity, not uniformity, that the finest fiber and deepest principle of natural life is found. So in all the mysteries and all of the wonder and the inherent curiosity that God has gifted humanity with in Kuyper's vision, this corresponds to all of the things out there in the world to discover, both about creation itself, its inner workings, unlocking the secrets, unraveling the mysteries, but what that displays to us, in turn, corrected, of course, in a Calvinist view by the scriptures as the spectacles that clarify our vision of reality, of what that teaches us about God himself. And this is against many caricatures, perhaps, of Calvinism, an intrinsically Calvinist kind of way of thinking about things. So there's an inherent relationship here between what's taken often to be one of Kuyper's signature teachings related to common grace and a concern for what we might call secondary causality, that is, the way the world is ordered and how it all works together. Calvin himself said, a godly man will not overlook the secondary causes. And so this investigation into the secondary causes, the wisdom that's intrinsic and ingrained in the universe is something that's inherently Calvinist, certainly in Kuyper's own understanding. This is his own rationale, of course, for emphasizing the doctrine of common grace. So he says Calvin talks about and affirms the doctrine of common grace. It's present in the Reformed tradition, but it doesn't receive the emphasis that it deserved at the time for all kinds of historical reasons, partly because much of the controversy at the time was focused on questions of special revelation and salvation and soteriology and the church and ecclesiology and justification and these kinds of things. So for Kuyper, his work on common grace is filling a lacuna in the Reformed tradition that's genuine and is there, but had been remained in kind of germinal or seed form since the 16th century. So Kuyper says, for example, there's found in Calvinism an impulse, an inclination, an incentive to scientific investigation. And elsewhere he says, taken it's an authentic form, God sent science or scholarship that is human learning to us as an angel of light. And science in this sense is a primal creature of God, a primal creation of God. For Kuyper, it was intended in the created order because God created us in his image to pursue these things. A phrase that you'll hear again and again in this context, and I'll probably say it again later, is thinking God's thoughts after him, which is one definition of theology, but for Kuyper, it's also a definition of what science itself is, what human learning itself is. One further clarification as we introduce Kuyper's thinking on science and religion is the Dutch term Wetenschap, which corresponds to the German idea of Wissenschaft. And most often, certainly when you're reading Kuyper in translation and you come across a word like science, this is often the term that's behind it. And by this, Kuyper really does mean science in the broadest, perhaps even the oldest classical sense, certainly etymologically related to just knowing, the idea of skio, knowing. So it encompasses all of human knowledge for Kuyper. It can also be translated in different contexts as scholarship or learning, as I've already indicated. He does talk about the relationship of what in the English language and the English tradition we often talk of as science proper, or Kuyper will refer to the French terms of precise science or exact sciences, or sometimes we call them more narrowly the natural sciences. Kuyper himself somewhat wryly observes in some of his writings on science that in England only what someone has measured, weighed, or counted is regarded as science. So that's one of the distinctions I think to keep in mind as we're talking about Kuyper and science. And I'll try to clarify when I'm talking about science in that more narrow sense with respect to natural science versus the broader Kuyperian sense, you could say, the primary Kuyperian sense of knowledge in all its in all it encompasses. Now, certainly Kuyper, as you might guess, based on this more distant historical background and grounding in Calvinism, identifies himself with the broader Augustinian and Western tradition of faith-seeking understanding. So for Kuyper, this understanding of the relationship between faith and science, religion and science, is something, again, that's intrinsic to Christian theology in the Western Augustinian Calvinist tradition. So Augustine's there pictured, and this formula is associated with him and mediated to us through Anselm of Canterbury, of course. And so Kuyper, against many contemporary understandings of the relationship between faith and learning and faith and science, sees these two as intrinsically related. So he says, for example, I do not speak of a conflict between faith and science. Such a conflict does not exist. Every science in a certain degree starts from faith. And on the contrary, faith, which does not lead to science, is mistaken faith or superstition, but real, genuine faith. It is not. So not only is there not a conflict, but one necessarily leads to the other. One of the things that's going on in science is, for Kuyper, an attempt to understand the intrinsic relationship between things in the world, between elements of reality and their interrelationships. So this gets to the question of worldview. Certainly for Kuyper, if there isn't a conflict between faith and science, it's because everyone is pursuing science and learning in their own way, and is pursuing that out of a faith tradition, out of a faith conviction. One way of understanding this idea of worldview, which is also popularized by Kuyper and communicated to us through Kuyper and many others in that tradition, is an attempt to articulate the foundational relationships between humanity and the transcendent, God, the divine, humanity and other humans, so between human being and human being, and then between humanity taken as a whole and the rest of the created order or the natural world. And the answer, the formulation of the details of these kinds of relationships are what constitute different kinds of worldviews or faith convictions. Another way of understanding it that often comes up in Kuyper's his own, this is the framework that he adopts, is an attempt to address the origin, the essence, and the telos, or the end, or the goal of a created thing, of anything. So this is a kind of what I think of as a kind of a modified scholastic approach, even though the term scholastic has a very negative connotation in many cases for Kuyper. He's essentially adopting this traditional Aristotelian or peripatetic kind of approach that it wants to investigate where things are coming from, where things are going, and what they're doing while they're here. In the Reformed tradition, this is often associated with a framework of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. But what's important for this, especially for this argument that Kuyper's making about the intrinsic relationship between faith and science, is that there's a pistic or faith foundation for all of human self-consciousness. So Kuyper says, for example, the human spirit cannot get by for long without an answer to questions concerning the origin, the essence, and the future of things. He says elsewhere, all knowledge proceeds from faith of whatever kind. A person relies on God, or he proceeds from his inner self, or he holds fast to some ideal. The person who believes nothing does not exist. More proximate to Kuyper's own time is the phenomenon of modernity. And there's a complex relationship, of course, between Kuyper and modernity. There's a reason that he's called a kind of a neo-Calvinist, and that label gets applied to him as opposed to, say, a paleo-Calvinist or a Gnasio-Calvinist or something like that. He is living and working in the context of the late 19th and early 20th century. And his goal, even though it's Calvinist in, say, its origin, and in some sense deeply Calvinist in terms of its nature and its essence, its orientation and its context is deeply formed by Kuyper's own understanding of the culture in which he lives. He is against repristination in this kind of narrow sense of looking back to the past as if we could somehow reinaugurate Calvin's Geneva, as if that's something we'd want to do from the 16th century in the Netherlands, say in the 19th century. So there are many different faiths of modernity, which Kuyper certainly sees as a danger, and many of the texts in which he talks about the relationship between faith and science, or between religion and science, have to do with him sounding the alarm bell about the dangers of many of these modern worldviews. And he goes into great detail, often polemically, often with some nuance and appreciation, into the intricacies and unraveling the internal coherence and the genealogy of many of these modern worldviews. The picture there is Darwin. Kuyper writes about evolution. There are many other dangers associated in Kuyper's mind, ideologies, you could say, with modernity. Modernism, certainly in the theological context, for theology as a science, modernism is a danger. For Kuyper, it's accommodating too much to rationalism and various other kinds of intellectual trends. The danger of naturalism, that is attempting to explain everything along purely natural causes, or materialism, or closely related philosophy. One of the big bugbears for Kuyper is pantheism. A sort of play on words, he sees it everywhere in his analysis of modernity and modern worldviews. And then he's also concerned about a kind of scientism, the social role, we could say, that science plays, certainly within the academy, but also more broadly, what is the right place of science and learning and academic scholarship within the context of a modern society. There are geniuses he recognizes within modernity. Darwin is one that he names explicitly on multiple occasions. Spinoza, he respects in many ways, not least of which for his defense of intellectual inquiry and the sovereignty, you could say, of scholarship. Nietzsche and Hegel are others that he recognizes as geniuses in their own right, which bring along, which makes them, in the sense, the kinds of threats to the truth in Kuyper's understanding that are worthwhile to engage. And I should say that even though Kuyper is in many ways polemic and sometimes dismissive, he, taken on his own terms, I don't think would ever grant that there's nothing to learn from it positively from any of these figures. In fact, he says so explicitly. So we'll get into that a little bit more as we dive deeper into the relationship between Kuyper's understanding of science as pursued out of a Christian worldview and science as it's pursued out of an alternative, say, modern secular kind of a worldview. And so for Kuyper, there are explicitly two kinds of science. We might say there are two or more kinds of science, given that there's not just two worldviews, but at a typological level, Kuyper wants to distinguish between, at a principled way, between sort of the science of Christian belief that's pursued by Christian believers and the science that's pursued by non-believers. And one of the terms that comes up again and again in Kuyper's writing is the Greek term palingenesis, which just means rebirth or renewal, conversion. And so for Kuyper, the reality of spiritual conversion creates a dichotomy between the Christian and the non-Christian that is in some sense and in many ways an insuperable gap. The other terminology that he'll use to describe this dichotomy is somewhat less mellifluous, normalists versus abnormalists. And the normalists are the unbelievers. They're the people who believe that the world is as it always has been and always will be, and that basically what we see out in the world in our empirical and other kinds of investigations and our existential experiences is normal. From the Christian perspective, and certainly the Reformed perspective that has this understanding of the fall and of sin, there's a deep sense and understanding that things are abnormal. They're not the way they're supposed to be, which is one understanding of sin. So that's another way that Kuyper describes it. You could talk about it as regenerate science versus unregenerate. Not to be said that's degenerate science, although there is Kuyper's understanding that science can take these kinds of degenerate forms and certainly immoral consequences of different kinds of worldviews. So Kuyper says, for example, not faith and science, therefore, but are to be opposed, but two scientific systems, or if you choose, two scientific elaborations are opposed to each other, each having its own faith. In many places, he speaks of this kind of antithesis between these two very polemically. So he'll say, for example, the normal and the abnormal are two absolutely different starting points, which have nothing in common in their origin. Parallel lines never intersect. You have to choose either the one or the other. But whatever you may choose, whatever you are as a scientific man, you have to be it consistently, not only in the faculty of theology, but in all faculties, in your entire world and life view, in the full reflection of the whole world picture from the mirror of your human consciousness. So there we've got the image of a starting point in different lines. And for Kuyper, at least in this kind of context, he's talking very polemically about the antithesis, or very strongly about this antithesis between the regenerate and the unregenerate, and parallel lines never intersect. He also used the imagery of houses. So he says, there are two different houses. All of this study in the circle of the one as well as in that of the other founds, builds, and assists in the construction of a whole. But we emphatically assert that these two kinds of people devote their time and their strength to the erection of two different structures, each of which purposes to be a complete building of science. So you've got competition there between the Christian pursuit and understanding of science and the non-Christian. So he uses this imagery of paths or lines, houses, but in other places he uses the imagery, more organic imagery perhaps, which is comes naturally to Kuyper in terms of his thinking of a tree. So, for example, he'll talk about science as a tree in this sense. He'll say near the ground of the tree of science is one for all, but no sooner has it reached a certain height than two branches separate, in the same way as may be seen in a tree which is grafted on the right side, while on the left side there's allowed to grow a shoot from the wild root. In its lowest parts, the tree is one, but at a given height it divides itself, and in this twofold development, one branch grows side by side with the other. So this is an alternative kind of emphasis for Kuyper, is that yes, maybe actually there is a deeper kind of unity, even in the context of very strong rhetorical division or dichotomy between these two kinds of science. Elsewhere, he'll say again, science and scholarship is a common human endeavor, and he who shuts himself up within his own circle without ever having it out with those who think otherwise leaves the refreshing stream and ends up in a stagnant bog. So even in the context perhaps of the most strongly formulated understanding of Kuyper's, where there's two different buildings that are being built, maybe there are some building materials that are common to both and are put together in different plans. And certainly these two houses need to be talking to one another and struggling with one another. Not to say going to war in a literal sense with one another, but the war of ideas in a sense, the challenge, the mutual critique of scholarship that characterizes the life of the scholar for Kuyper. He says a little bit more explicitly about what this common ground is, which I think is important to note. And so he's got these three that I list here on the screen. Let me just say a little bit too, that for Kuyper, the elements or the scope of how much common ground there is differs depending on what kind of scientific or disciplinary inquiry we're talking about. So he talks about the natural sciences, the more empirical sciences, and then relates those to what he also calls mixed or pure spiritual sciences. Sometimes he calls them psychical sciences. And we can think of these more as like the human sciences or the social sciences on the one hand, and other things like, for Kuyper, theology on the other would be the closest perhaps to a pure spiritual science. But it's a continuum. So because human beings are these psychosomatic unities that have both body and soul on the Kuyper's worldview, there's a continuum of sciences, of modes of investigation that look at different parts of the cosmos and that microcosmos that is the human person. So the ones that emphasize are focused more exclusively, say, on material realities, there's going to be more common ground between these two kinds of science for Kuyper. And the ones that have more of a focus on either include more what he would call the spiritual or psychical side, or focus exclusively on that, the greater the departure is going to be between the two. So the common ground, and this would relate most primarily to empirical sciences, the things that are focused on measurable, observable facts, objectively observable facts, to use Kuyper's phrase. That's one place where these two kinds of science for Kuyper come together. Now he says, if you study reality and honor the laws of its existence, then in your thinking you will again and again encounter that which stubbornly resists your generalization. So there's a stubbornness to reality itself, and this dialectic between the investigator and what's being investigated, and what's a very deeply scientific way of understanding that our theories and our subjective understandings are constantly to be corrected and conformed to what we find in the world, in the real world. He says elsewhere that everything that is material and can consequently be counted, weighed, and measured no doubt offers us, at least as far as these relations are concerned, a universally compulsory certainty, which, if observation be correct, bears an absolutely objective character. That's independent of the subjective investigator for Kuyper. As soon, however, as you venture one step farther in this physical domain, and from these empiric data try to obtain a construction by which to discover among these scattered data a unity of thought, the process of an idea or the progression from a first phenomenon to a result, you've at once crossed over from the physical into the psychical. The universally compulsory certainty leaves you, and you glide back into subjective knowledge, since you are already within the domain of the spiritual sciences. So there's a sense in which even in the natural sciences, most narrowly construed, there is a subjective element that's unavoidable and foundational for Kuyper in the scientific enterprise. So that's enough, I think, about objectively observable facts. Maybe we'll return to those in the Q&A. I will just say one more thing here. Again, it's important for Kuyper that it doesn't matter, in this sense, the worldview of the person who's doing the investigating at the level of the subjective, what he calls the subjectively observable fact. So he'll even say, for example, that as much as he opposes Darwinism as kind of a world and life view, evolutionary scientists have uncovered empirical realities, and in doing so have done service to both types of scientists, he'll say. And again, this relates to the bodily and physical dimensions of whatever spiritual realities we're talking about. So if you want to talk about the human person for Kuyper, as I said, it's a psychosomatic, psychical and somatic unity, but there's an intrinsic incarnational element of humanity that has to be accounted for, as well as a spiritual and a moral side that cannot be discounted or omitted from our understanding. And so human beings are moral beings, irreducibly moral beings, and there's psychosomatic unities. But on the side where we're talking about measuring things like physiologically or something like that, again, there is this common ground between these two kinds of science. And finally, in terms of logical argumentation, so for someone like Kuyper, who's an avowed Calvinist, who confesses the reality of the comprehensive nature of the fall in all of creation, it's really important when you come across things where he's talking about things like logic and reason. Like this, he says, the formal process of thought has not been attacked by sin. And for this reason, palingenesis, or regeneration, works no change in the mental task. There is but one logic and not two. So on the level of logical ordering, again, there's common ground between these two kinds of scientific inquiries. We can extrapolate from that, and for Kuyper, things like arithmetic, counting, measuring, those in some sense have not been intrinsically affected by the fall. Again, he says the formal process of thought has not been attacked by sin. Now, this doesn't mean that fallen humanity reasons infallibly. It just means, in a sense, that the rules of logic, the structure of logic that's intrinsic to the created order, has not changed because of the fall in some deeply objective and absolute sense. So this is Kuyper's understanding, basic understanding of science, regenerate science versus unregenerate science, or the abnormalist science versus the normalist science. And so this is a brief sketch of his kind of academic understanding of these two things. Because Kuyper was a kind of a social entrepreneur in many ways and a cultural dynamo, it's not enough for him in his own life to leave these at the level of abstraction or at the level of thought or even at the level of writing. He feels the need to follow through and create institutions within which his vision of science, properly understood, can be pursued. And that's where the institution of the Free University comes in primarily for Kuyper. Although, I should say, even though Kuyper was the famous founder of the Free University, this institution of higher learning, this unity of vision of religion and learning, religion and science for Kuyper really goes throughout the entirety of the educational system and structure for Kuyper. So one of his entrees into politics actually was the school struggle for parity and equality of funding for religious versus government schools in the context of the Netherlands, not at first of all at the university level, but at the level of primary and secondary education. So Kuyper's vision for the free university, the free meaning free of institutional control by the church and the state, is deeply rooted in his understanding of sphere sovereignty, another trademark or characteristic teaching of Kuyper. And in fact, his address at the founding of the Free University is a speech on sphere sovereignty. And I'm gonna read a little bit from that just to try to set the stage for an understanding of what Kuyper's trying to accomplish in founding this university, what we could understand as science in its social expression, an academic institution. Now here's the glorious principle of liberty, says Kuyper. This absolute sovereignty of the sinless Messiah at the same time directly denies and disputes all absolute sovereignty on earth among sinful men. The life of humankind is divided into distinct spheres, each with its own sovereignty. Human life, with its visible material foreground and its invisible spiritual background, appears neither simple nor uniform, but constitutes an infinitely composite organism. It is structured in such a way that what is individual exists only in groups, and only in groups can the whole become manifest. Later on, he says, he's talking about all of these different domains. He says there's a domain of nature whose sovereign uses energy to work on physical matter according to fixed laws. Similarly, there are domains of personal, domestic, scientific, socioeconomic, and ecclesiastical life, each of which obeys its own laws and stands under its own supreme authority. There's a domain for thought, where no other laws but those of logic may rule. There's a domain of the conscience, where none but the Holy One may give sovereign commands. And finally, there's a domain of faith, where the person alone is the sovereign who through faith consecrates himself in his innermost being. So this is at the core of his understanding of the Free University, is an institutional expression of the sovereignty of the sphere of science, or scholarship, we might say. This is the seal of the Free University. The Latin there is abbreviated for our help is in the name of the Lord. And I'll say a little bit more about the picture on the seal as we explicate a little bit more of Kuyper's understanding of the relationship, the role that science has in respect to the academy. So again, there's an understanding that sovereign in its own sphere, in the academic sphere, is the rules of logic. And for Kuyper, in the context of these competing worldviews, the modern worldviews and their variations, and the Reformed world and life view, he's pursuing the Free University out of an understanding of what the institutional form of faithful life should look like in this kind of pluralistic context. So he says, for example, with a view to our own struggle, I mean that those who still have faith and discern the danger of blurring the boundaries must start by drawing a line around their own circle, must develop a life of their own within that circle, must render account for the life thus constituted, and so acquire the maturity needed for the struggle they must at some points accept. So in building the Free University as a university defined by this commitment to reform principles of divine sovereignty and all those kinds of Calvinistic points of departure we talked about earlier, it's creating a circle within the broader Dutch context, and certainly even the global context with respect to the academic world. So there's the circle in the broad sense that is on the seal is a kind of visible representation of what he's talking about. It's a wall in the sense that separates, and certainly within the picture itself, there's a hedge that protects, that stands as a kind of a guard for what's going on, what's proposed, the mission of this Free University. Now he says a lot about the ideal interrelationship of the academic disciplines, what he calls the encyclopedia. Another way of understanding is the science of science is central for him. In his Encyclopedia of Theology, he gives a sketch of what the relationship between theology and the other disciplines should be, but certainly what the science of sciences should be, or the methodology of science ought to be. And as I said at the very beginning for Kuyper, scientific thought is deeply related to order. So he says, for example, that thought by its very nature tends towards system. One of the results of which is that the different starting points, the different faith starting points for different people create different kinds of competing systems. There's a kind of ontological sense in which reality is primary for Kuyper, but subjectivity is not thereby lessened. So there's a interplay between reality and subjective consciousness for Kuyper, and certainly the subjective consciousness of a scientific investigator. And because of his understanding of the divine and created reality, that in some sense comes first for Kuyper. So he'll say, for example, our human spirit is not to invent a certain order for our knowledge. So we by nature create systems, try to put things in order that makes sense. But our role is not to invent arbitrarily, in some sense, systems or a certain order for our knowledge, but to seek out and to indicate the order which is already there. So it's a discovery in some sense. It's a discovery of the order that's out there, and then it's an ordering of our discoveries subjectively. So one way of understanding what science is for Kuyper is as the discovery and ordering of organic or created order. For Kuyper, of course, this points back to an orderer, as we've already mentioned. There's a very explicit faith point of departure for Kuyper, and this idea of thinking God's thoughts after him. So there's an intrinsic order that God has placed in the creation, and the role of the investigator is to discover that order. So he says, for example, when we study these relations, that is the relations that are in the world between things, between phenomena, we merely think the thought over again by which the subject, the capital S subject, defined these relations when he called them into being. If there were no thought embedded in the object, it could not be digestible to our thinking, because that's the way that we have been created, to have a correspondence, in a sense, between reality and our own thinking. I'll say a little bit more about the relationship between theology and the sciences and Kuyper's understanding. Certainly the traditional classical understanding was theology as the queen of the sciences. There's been some debate about the place that theology ought to have in the academic enterprise, certainly since the Enlightenment, and in Kuyper's own tradition. For Kuyper, the science of science, that is the ordering of the scientific endeavor, is explicitly not a theological enterprise. And in some sense, this encyclopedic discipline is itself the ordering method for the sciences, and he locates it as under philosophy. So there are 5 faculties that he identifies: the philological, and he notes there's some terminological dispute at his time about whether it should be called the philosophical versus the philological. He prefers philological, and then putting philosophy under philological. The medical, juridical, natural philosophical, or scientific, we might call it these days, and theological faculties. And each one of these disciplines within the broader Academy of Science has its own intrinsic sovereignty and its own rules to the game, their own proper methodology. So for example, he says, in the same manner, every science has to keep up the closest connection with its subject and strictly to obey the claims of its proper method. And only when strictly bound by this double tie can science move freely on. For the liberty of science does not consist in licentiousness or lawlessness, but in being freed from all unnatural bonds. Unnatural because they're not rooted in its vital principle. So there's an intrinsic methodology that's appropriate to each one of the disciplines that has to be discovered, understood on its own terms, but then also in relation to each of the other disciplines, and then an overarching understanding of how all of these disciplines fit together. At one point, he calls this systematics, by which he doesn't mean something like systematic theology. He means systematic ordering of the science of sciences. Systematics, as the queen of the sciences, he says, comes forth from her tent to weave all the different results these different scientific disciplines into one organic whole. And I'll conclude this section with just the definition that he has of what he calls encyclopedia. That philosophical, the encyclopedia is that philosophical science which in the entire thesaurus or treasury of our scientific knowledge thus far acquired exhibits and interprets the organic existence of science in its several parts. So again, it's the ordering of the order that's discovered in the world. So enough for now about science and its kind of institutional forms. I want to move towards concluding by talking about Kuyper's view of science in the Christian life and how this relates to the Christian faith. And on his understanding, science and scholarship is a vocation. That's a clear emphasis for Kuyper. There's a sense in which the point of science is to serve, to be of service in the world, and it's to fulfill God's purposes in the world. Scholarship itself is a privilege. He's explicit about this. And it involves these three key elements that I've got there on the screen: discovery, enjoyment, and service. We've talked about science as discovering the reality and the interrelationship of the truths that are out there. But again, there's a sense in which we're only discovering it in a subjective sense. It's already out there. The order's already out there. There's not an imposition of the order on an orderless world, or an imposition of law on a lawless world. It's discovering the intent and the wisdom of the created order that's placed there and been intended there by the Creator. So he says, for example, such is the case in every sphere of life. It's not we who pursue the ideal, but the ideal which pursues us, apprehends us, masters us, drenches the depths of our being with its fullness, and molds our empty form increasingly to itself. So there's a role for science in the sense to discover the order that's out there and conform yourself to the reality in your thinking, and then as that follows through in the rest of your life. Certainly scholarship and scientific endeavor is meant to be enjoyed. He clarifies that you're meant to find things, but the seeking should be enjoyable too. And certainly on a Christian understanding of vocation, these forms of service of whatever kind they take are meant to be enjoyed and seen in relationship to serving God and others. And so there's a deep sense in which the joy of discovery for Kuyper is intrinsic to the scientific endeavor, the curiosity, the wonder, the doxastic kind of experiences you might have at gazing at the cosmos, the starry heavens, and being, the feeling of transcendence that you get. So there's a deep sense in which enjoyment is also constitutive of scholarship as a vocation for Kuyper. And the end, you might say, of scholarship for Kuyper is service. Certainly the creation of science, understood in its broadest sense, is a worthy endeavor that has intrinsic value, but he's deeply opposed to any understanding of, say, the social institution of a university that is focused only on its own good. The point of these social institutions and of individual Christian vocations is to be of service to God's world. One way that service is performed is by fulfilling the kinds of necessary tasks that adhere to human nature, or that follow from the nature of human beings. So, for example, Kuyper says, human life is never fully developed as long as you have not explained that life to the satisfaction of your own thinking, that is, scientifically. So there's a subjective sense in which we all have to come to this, fulfill our duties to order our thoughts and our thinking about the world appropriately. But there's a broader sense in which that knowledge can then be put to service. He says, for example, a single educated man in a humble village is for that village the hub of a higher life. A scholar's mission in life, you could say a scientist's mission in life, should be to serve and not to be served. There's a deep intrinsic connection in which this truth is to be put into the service of the betterment of the world. Building the temple. This is another kind of image that Kuyper uses. We've talked about the path, diverging paths or parallel lines. a tree that has different branches growing off of it. One other dominant image for Kuyper is this idea of a temple that is being built in the context of scientific pursuits and endeavors through the centuries. So he says, for example, science might be viewed as a mighty temple whose foundations had to be dug first, after which its foundation had to be set. Only then could its walls be erected on that foundation and its battlements be built once the walls were finished. The temple can display the full splendor of its contours, its colors, and its shapes only when the entire building is completed. Now, of course, for Kuyper, this is an intergenerational and communal endeavor. It's not the work, however brilliant, of an individual genius. It's the work of the entire human community spread throughout history. And this is deeply related to Kuyper's understanding of the image of God. So he says, for example, the principal confession by the Christian that human beings are created in God's image reaches much further than the acknowledgement that each of us personally and individually belongs to God's race. Rather, it comes into its own only when we extend it to our entire race down through the ages, and then combine it with the talents that are bestowed upon all the individuals who comprise the human race. It's not the case that one mere individual brain or one mere individual genius or one mere individual talent has been equipped to understand the fullness of God's word and of the word in creation. Rather, all the human race together contributes towards the end of human comprehension. So the pursuit of science as an endeavor is supra-individual in this sense, and it's supra-historical in this sense too, and that it applies to the fullness of the human race, as you can understand it most broadly. I want to say a little bit about the understanding of technology and scientific advancement to improve the lot of humanity and combat the effects of sin, which I hinted at in the earlier comments about service. Kuyper is very explicit about this, that God has given us reason and intellect in the imago Dei, in which he's created everyone, and the proper stewardship, the proper use of these faculties is to do good in the world. And certainly in a fallen world, in the world in which there is sin and evil and suffering, we have to use our minds, apply them to the secondary causes, discover the interrelationships of these secondary causes to ameliorate to the best of our ability the effects and consequences of sin that we experience in this world. And foremost for him and his thinking are the medical sciences and things like vaccines, which of course for us now, as 100 years after Kuyper, still has a very existential kind of import as we deal with epidemics. Kuyper is very explicit that it's the Christian's duty to apply his or her mind to God's creation, to understanding the relationships of the chemical relationships, the physiological relationships, the physical and spiritual interrelationships of the human person, and come up with remedies. And that's one of the main motivations and outputs or consequences, you could say, of science for Kuyper. I could have concluded with an image too, and I think it would have been appropriate, of not say something like building of the temple, the second temple, but something like the Tower of Babel. Because for Kuyper, there is a kind of a shadow side to scientific advancement. It's not in the sense that we should shun it, but it's in that in the context of a fallen world, there are going to be deleterious and immoral and evil consequences that follow, because human beings, having been warped by sin, inevitably put to bad use the good gifts that we've been given. So I'll just say highlight one comment that Kuyper makes about the dangers of technological advancement. He says, man then, with his superior power and overstimulated sense of self, has thrust himself upon a defenseless nature and has mastered it, has led it in a victory procession behind the chariot of his science and sensibility. So there is a shadow side that Kuyper thinks we have to acknowledge and come to grips with too, and be clear-eyed and realistic about from a Christian perspective, which doesn't obviate the abuse of something, doesn't obviate its proper use. And so even as Kuyper is committed to viewing scientific enterprise in its broadest sense as not only something to be praise, but something that's necessary for the Christian faith. It's important to realize that there are abuses that will inevitably follow too, and do our best to ameliorate those as well. Before we move on to questions, I just want to highlight some of the primary sources that have gone into my attempt to order Kuyper's thinking about religion and science a little bit as I presented it here. And I'll say a little bit about where these are located. All the ones on this list are, to one extent or another, available in English translation. And I've ordered them chronologically. So I began with Uniformity, the Curse of Modern Life, a lecture that he gave. AKCR stands for the Abraham Kuyper Centennial Reader that James Bratt put together in 1998. And so that's this volume. AKCWPT is the Abraham Kuyper Collected Works in Public Theology. So those are what those two indicate, that there's at least a version of those that are in one or the other in English translation for each of those works. The exception being Calvinism and Science from 1998. That's from Lectures on Calvinism, Kuyper Stone Lectures from 1898. That's down there. And the Encyclopedia of Sacred Theology, which is available in partial 19th century translation in English. So that's a list of the primary sources that I thought were the most important and most accessible for Kuyper and understanding his relationship of his view of the relationship between science and religion. This year was the Kuyper Centennial. As John mentioned, there were plans for a Kuyper Centennial Congress in April in New York City and upcoming in November in Amsterdam. The April event in New York City was postponed and canceled essentially. Programming is pushed to other events. The Centennial Congress in Amsterdam in November is going to proceed, but it's going to be closed to everyone except presenters. I believe there will be some online presentations, though, either live streamed or recorded and then put up on YouTube later. Some of the programming that I mentioned that was canceled from this year is going to be pushed to the annual Kuyper Conference, which is held at Calvin University and Calvin Theological Seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan. That's going to be the week of April 26, 2021. That's the date that's planned for it right now. I mentioned the Abraham Kuyper Collected Works in Public Theology. That's a 12-volume translation project, and it's coming towards its completion. The final 2 volumes will be out in 2021. And as John mentioned, the seminars that were planned, the event that was planned for this year, the centennial year at the Faraday Institute, are going to be pushed, I think you said September 2021. So those are some things that are coming out of the Kuyper Centennial. And that's it for me. I'm happy to take some questions and have some discussions. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Ballor. That was wonderful and a great introduction, truly. Both conceptually and introducing those texts was really helpful at the end as well.